This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 451 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. As always, thanks for tuning in. Thanksgiving is upon us, and FanDuel is giving you the opportunity to win big this holiday season. For just $5.55, you can enter the NFL Thanksgiving Million and compete for your share of the $1.5 million prize pool, including a $500,000 first place prize. Turkey Day is just a few days away, so download the FanDuel mobile app and submit your lineups now. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Add Taysom Hill. So I can understand if you had Taysom Hill and you didn't start him this past week because there was a lot of question marks entering that game. Even though they said that Taysom Hill was going to start, we didn't know what that was going to look like. We knew there was a lot of upside and a lot of potential because of what Taysom Hill can do with his legs, but we didn't know exactly how many times he would touch the ball. But he delivered. He had a great game. It was a plus matchup. He had the best matchup possible in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed when he faced the Falcons. But he still exceeded expectations. He scored 24.4 points. That was a top 5 number at the quarterback position in week 11. And he did it in sort of like a Drew Brees plus kind of way. He was very methodical with his passing. He threw a lot of high percentage throws. He had the fewest air yards of any starter in the NFL on Sunday. But I will say, he threw the ball deep 3 times. He had 3 15-plus air yard throws, and he completed all of them. But most importantly, from a fantasy perspective, he got it done on the ground. We always talk about the cheat code that rushing quarterbacks bring to fantasy football. And Taysom Hill brought that in week 11. He ran the ball 10 times, he had 51 rushing yards, and he had 2 rushing touchdowns. That's the reason that Taysom Hill is very viable moving forward. And Brees is going to be out for at least 2 more weeks because he's on IR. And over those games, Hill's going to get Denver and then Atlanta again. Those are 2 matchups that he can exploit. So I like Taysom Hill as a plug-and-play starter moving forward. Buy Allen Robinson. The Bears are a disaster offensively. At the time of this recording, I don't even know who's going to start for them this week. But it's really, really tough to ignore their rest of season schedule. And that's going to benefit Allen Robinson. And Robinson always sort of flies under the radar in fantasy football because he's in this bad offense. But he's seen almost 25% of Chicago's targets this year. Now that's a good target share. It's not the best target share in the league, but it's a good target share, especially considering, like I talked about on the show last week, Chicago's been a very pass-heavy team. They have the 3rd most pass attempts in football, and they have the highest pass-to-rush ratio in football. So Robinson's seeing this 25% target share in a pass-heavy offense. That means lots and lots of volume. And for what it's worth, he does have a little bit of touchdown regression coming as well on the positive end. He scored only 3 times this year when some models, like Pro Football Focus's model, they say that he should have 3.5 touchdowns. But this is really about the schedule. Now, the Bears do get a tougher matchup this week against Green Bay, but I wouldn't want to wait and see if Robinson has a down game because Chicago's coming off their bye. What if Chicago comes out and they look decent? So I would pounce right now because after the Packers, the Bears get the Lions, Texans, Vikings, and Jags through the end of the fantasy season. Those are all top half matchups for wide receivers when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. Sell Melvin Gordon. Melvin Gordon had his first top 10 performance since week 4 on Sunday. But when you dig in and you look at his numbers and you look at his usage, it really wasn't that impressive. Yes, he found the end zone a couple of times. That's great. He averaged almost 6 yards per carry. That's great too. But he also handled only 48.4% of Denver's running back rushes, and he didn't see a single target. Since Phillip Lindsay came back from his injury, Melvin Gordon has averaged a running back rush share per game of 54.3%. Without Lindsay this year, that number's 80%. Melvin Gordon's usage is not very good, and that's on top of being in an offense that's not very good. So you have an opportunity to sell Melvin Gordon off of this big game. Go ahead and do it. Add James White. So I want to preface and say that the waiver wire sucks this week. It's probably the worst waiver wire week of the entire season. So if you need some help, I'm sorry. This is not the best week to get some help. I do think, though, that if James White is on your waiver wire, you should be adding him this week. He's probably the top priority. He's still out there in about 60% of Yahoo leagues. And on Sunday, he had a 23.7% target share. That was his highest mark since week 6. And he played his highest snap share of the season at 56.5%. This is the result of a Rex Burkhead injury. At the time of this recording, they're fearing that Rex Burkhead tore his ACL. And we know that anytime there's a fear that there's a torn ACL, there's usually a torn ACL. So if he's done for the year, then White is going to walk into a bigger pass catching role. The role that he essentially lost to Rex Burkhead. I don't think that we can probably count on James White week in and week out, but he's fine enough as a flex play moving forward in PPR formats. Sell Damian Harris. So this might seem counterintuitive. Rex Burkhead's now probably out for the year, and I'm telling you to sell Damian Harris, one of his backfield mates. This Burkhead news probably does help Damian Harris in some way. Anytime you remove a piece of a backfield, it helps the other running backs in that backfield, at least from a fantasy standpoint. And I mean, before Sunday's game, Burkhead was seeing a running back rush share per game of about 31%. His target share per game was 12.6%. So those numbers leaving the backfield is good for every other running back in that backfield. But there's two problems. The first one is what I just talked about, James White. White is probably going to be the guy who just kind of slots in and becomes the pass catching back once again in this offense. Damian Harris has 4 targets this season. It's not like he's been used as a receiver. But then on top of that, number 2, the other problem is that Sony Michel should be back. Remember that guy? He was activated off of IR this past week, but he didn't play against the Texans. But guys, we've done this before. We know how New England utilizes their running backs. They have these early down guys and they have these pass catching specialists. And Sony Michel is an early down guy. That's how he's been used in New England. That could dig into Damian Harris's workload. Now, with all that being said, I still expect Harris to be the 1A in that backfield. It's just that he's coming off of some strong performances. And then this Rex Burkhead injury happened. So you have an opportunity to sell him pretty high right now. I don't mind the schedule for New England moving forward, but I would still shop Harris because I generally like shopping New England Patriot running backs. And to me, and you guys know this is my philosophy, but it's generally smart to not buy into players or running backs who don't see significant receiving volume, unless that guy's Derrick Henry. Buy Jamal Williams. So last week I talked about Aaron Jones as being a buy. He came through with a top 10 performance at the running back position. Now, I'm not patting myself on the back there, because the reason for buying Jones was not about his week 11 matchup. I mean, sure, I expected him to be decent, but it wasn't for that matchup against the Colts. It was for what's coming. The Packers have a great playoff schedule, and Aaron Jones was coming off some down games, so that combined with the schedule made him a good buy. Now enter Jamal Williams. Williams has had about 1/3 of Green Bay's running back rushes over the last 2 weeks after playing really well while Aaron Jones was sidelined. And Williams also scored on a goal line target, which shows us that the red zone is not just Aaron Jones's area of the field. They're going to use Jamal Williams there too. And again, one of the main reasons I liked Aaron Jones last week was because of who they're facing in the fantasy football playoffs. Green Bay gets Detroit, Carolina, and Tennessee in weeks 14, 15, and 16. If that's good for Aaron Jones, then it's good for Jamal Williams too. So I think that Williams has flex appeal, but then he also has a lot of upside too if something were to happen to Aaron Jones. Add Russell Gage. Julio Jones only played 22 snaps against the Saints on Sunday because he had a hamstring issue. And that allowed Russell Gage to do his typical high volume, low upside thing. That's what I wrote in my column, and I think it's very appropriate. Like, here's the thing. Russell Gage is fine. That's the best way to describe Russell Gage. He's fine. But if Jones misses time, you should probably look to add Russell Gage, because on Sunday he had 12 targets. But just do know that when he's had targets in the past, he hasn't done a whole lot. In week 1 against Seattle, feels like forever ago, but in week 1 against Seattle, he did score 20.4 PPR points on 12 targets. But since then, he's averaged just 8 PPR points per game. And that includes 2 games without Julio Jones. In those 2 games, Russell Gage had an 11.1% target share, and he combined to score 8.2 points. That's why this is not an automatic lock. You don't absolutely have to get Russell Gage off the waiver wire this week. Like I said, I think Russell Gage is fine, especially in a PPR league. But if Julio Jones misses time, it's not an automatic win for Russell Gage. Hold or buy Jonathan Taylor. All right, here goes. I'm sure people wanted me to talk about Jonathan Taylor this week, so I'm going to talk about Jonathan Taylor this week. So coming out of the bye, Indianapolis decided to not use Jonathan Taylor a lot. From weeks 8 through 10, the 3 games after the Colts bye, Taylor averaged a running back rush share per game of just 29.4%. Across his 5 games prior to that, that number was 67%. Now on Sunday, that shot back up to about 69%. I'm not going to say it. And he had a double-digit percentage target share for the first time since week 1. Jonathan Taylor had awesome usage in week 11, finally. So the question is, what do we do now? And the answer is, I don't really know. I like to be transparent about the way that I view fantasy football. I think it's very, very important. And the thing that I talk about with the running back position all the time is that coaches drive their value so much in fantasy football. If a coach doesn't want a running back on the field, that running back is not going to be fantasy football relevant. You could sort of make the same argument for wide receivers, but there's a difference. There are a lot of wide receivers on the field at once. And not only that, but a wide receiver needs to get open in order to see a target. So his volume is sort of driven more so by skill, whereas a running back volume is driven by a coach's choice. Now, you would hope that talent drives that coaching decision. If a running back is good, we hope the coach throws him on the field. And for what it's worth, even though Jonathan Taylor has not lived up to the hype, he's been the best running back in that backfield this year, at least from an analytical perspective. If you look at success rate, which measures the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a back, and that's all according to NumberFire's expected points model, Jonathan Taylor has a very similar success rate to Nyheim Hines. It's actually a little bit better. And his success rate is 5 percentage points better than Jordan Wilkins. And from a per rush efficiency standpoint, so we're talking about expected points added per rush, Jonathan Taylor is easily the best runner in that Colts backfield. It's not close. Maybe on Sunday, the Colts coaching staff finally realized this. And they said, we need to feature Jonathan Taylor and not so much Jordan Wilkins. We're going to make this a 2-headed backfield instead of a 3-headed backfield. Because Wilkins only played 10% of the Colts snaps on Sunday. That number had been significantly higher over the 3 previous games. And that showed up in the stat sheet. Wilkins had just 4 carries when his 3-game average before this game was 13. So again, I don't really know where this puts us, because the Colts could very easily decide to not feature Jonathan Taylor anymore. They've done that in the past. But the Colts really should be featuring him. Like, I know that he hasn't lived up to expectation since people like me were sitting behind our microphones telling you guys that he was going to be an RB1 this year. I know he hasn't lived up to that expectation, but he's still been the best running back in that team's backfield. And I know that people who have Jonathan Taylor in redraft right now are not very happy. He's burned them so many times this year. So while this is mostly a hold transaction, I do think that you could send an offer to those managers, those frustrated managers, and see if you can still buy low. And if you can't, no problem. I don't think he should be the biggest priority in the world because of how this coaching staff has operated this year. But at the very least, I would try to buy low this week. Add Jacob Hollister. So a lot of you need tight end help. And there's a chance, it's not a big chance, but there's a chance that Jacob Hollister could help you. Greg Olsen's going to be out for an extended period of time, and that leaves Seattle's tight end situation to Hollister and Will Dissly. I guess both are sort of in play as ads, but I would prefer Hollister over Dissly because of their recent numbers. Hollister has run more routes and he's seen more targets than Dissly over the team's last 3 games. Add Gus Edwards. So I was writing my 15 transactions column on Monday, and I saw a tweet that J.K. Dobbins and Mark Ingram tested positive for coronavirus. So number 1, I wish them a speedy recovery. But also this means that Gus Edwards is very much in play. I don't love the matchup this week against Pittsburgh. They're a top 5 team when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. So they're a bad matchup. But it's tough to find volume at the running back position on the waiver wire. So I would add Gus Edwards, maybe get a start out of him, maybe get RB2 production, and kind of go from there. And in deeper leagues, you could also add Justice Hill. Buy Robbie Anderson. So Anderson currently has a 27% target share in the Carolina Panthers offense, and he has 1 touchdown. Since 2011, we've only had 1 wide receiver with at least a 25% target share and 1 touchdown across the season. That was Brian Hartline, remember that guy, in 2012. Now, there were a couple of guys who had 2 touchdowns with that target share, but only one had 1 touchdown. So in other words, I would be shocked if Robbie Anderson doesn't find the end zone again this season. Now, I should say that it's not like Anderson's not scoring touchdowns while seeing so many red zone targets and a ton of end zone targets. He's tied for 30th among wide receivers in red zone targets. He's seen just 3 targets from within the 10-yard line. It's not like he's Devontae Adams. But even still, most models show that he should have closer to 3 or 4 touchdowns than the 1 touchdown that he has. I mean, consider this. He has 818 receiving yards right now. He's scoring 1 touchdown for every 818 yards. The average this season at wide receiver has been a touchdown on every 162.9 yards. Now, the Panthers still do have their bye. Keep that in mind if you're going to trade for Robbie Anderson. I'm just here to note that this current rate, considering his high target share, is not very sustainable. Maybe he doesn't score from here on out, but I'm just playing math here. Add Nelson Agholor. So we've seen spiked weeks from Agholor this season, but they've been nothing like what we saw on Sunday night. Prior to week 11, Agholor had hit a double-digit percentage target share in just 3 games this season. But on Sunday, that target share was 29%. That was his highest share of the year. He turned those targets into 6 catches for 88 yards and a score. And he led the team in wide receiver snaps. So I think that he's worth an add off the wire this week. Buy Miles Sanders. A lot of fantasy managers are going to be turned off by this Philadelphia Eagles offense. And it's hard to blame them. Carson Wentz has played horrifically. So that's going to turn people away from Miles Sanders. But I also think that creates a buying opportunity. Since Sanders returned from injury, so we have 2 games worth in this sample size, he's handled about 78% of Philadelphia's running back rushes, and he's had about a 14% target share. Those are very, very good numbers. He's ranked as the RB19 and the RB27 in weekly scoring and PPR formats, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that he hasn't found the end zone. Now, of course, we need Philly's offense to be better in order for those opportunities to come up. But they really only have 1 tough game left on their schedule. They get New Orleans in week 14, the first week of the fantasy playoffs. So with that being said, I think he's a great buy low pick for a team that's likely to see a first round bye, where you can avoid that New Orleans matchup. Because in weeks 15 and 16, the Eagles get the Cardinals and the Cowboys. Those are 2 decent matchups for Miles Sanders to exploit. Add Derek Carr. So Derek Carr, for the second time this season, looked good against Kansas City. He has 2 top 10 performances this year. They were both against the Chiefs. That might force people to move away from Carr. But don't, because he has a great matchup this weekend. I already mentioned earlier that Atlanta's the best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. This game, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, has a 55.5 point over-under. So it's a good matchup. It should be high scoring. That makes Derek Carr this week's top streamer. Add the New York Giants defense. So the Giants had their bye in week 11, and as a result, they're available in 85% of Yahoo leagues right now. And in week 12, they get the Bengals, who no longer have Joe Burrow. Ryan Finley's going to start. That's why the Giants are 4.5 point favorites in a game with a 42.5 point over-under. That alone, without looking at anything else, makes the Giants a viable defensive streamer. But then if you look at Ryan Finley's 3 starts last season, he was sacked 11 times and he was picked twice. And he's still playing behind this Bengals offensive line that has not been very good. They've allowed the 5th highest sack rate in football this year. So because of all that, the New York Giants are a very good streaming defense. The 16 transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add Denzel Mims. Mims is rostered in just 5% of Yahoo leagues right now, so he's probably available in yours. And yes, I know, he hasn't done a whole lot because he's in this Jets offense, and this Jets offense is a complete dumpster fire. I would rather watch a Keeping Up with the Kardashians marathon than watch a team coached by Adam Gase. But I can't deny what Denzel Mims' peripherals are showing. Since he's been healthy, so since week 7, Mims has seen 32%, 11%, 33%, and 29% of the Jets' targets. Those are his target shares per game. So if you're able to just stash someone, he's not a terrible option. But again, a lot of this has to do with the fact that the waiver wire is not very good this week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow.